The city slept under a blanket of wet, black velvet. Rain fell in steady, whispering sheets, painting the streets in shades of oil and ink. It was the kind of night that hid things, the kind of night that held secrets close to its chest. On a quiet curb, untouched by the neon glow of the more popular districts, a man stood beside a car that looked like a shard of polished darkness. This was Aldrich Varron. To most of the city, he was not just a man, he was a final answer. A story told in hushed tones. A name that could split a room into those who obeyed without question and those who trembled where they stood. His world was one of quiet threats and loud consequences, a world built on a foundation of unwavering control. He was just a silhouette against the downpour, the electronic chirp of his key fob a tiny, insignificant sound in the vast, rainy night. And then, the silence was broken. Not by a gunshot or a screeching tire, but by a sound that was entirely foreign to his orbit. A desperate, gasping plea. Please. The voice was a frayed thread of panic, a sound so raw it seemed to cut through the hum of the rain itself. He turned, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator assessing a new, unexpected variable in its environment. A woman was running toward him, her clothes plastered to her skin, her hair a dark, tangled mess. Her eyes were wide, wild with a fear that was so pure, so consuming, it was almost holy in its intensity. Please, she begged again, her voice cracking, my child is missing. Mara Solis was drowning on dry land. Every breath was a battle against the cold fist of terror squeezing her lungs. Her world, which just an hour ago had been about closing the cafe, counting the day's earnings, and reading a bedtime story to her son, had shattered into a million jagged pieces. Finn, her bright, 6-year-old boy, was gone. Vanished from the playground while her back was turned for a mere heartbeat. The rain had washed away any trace of him, any sound of his small footsteps. She had run, she had screamed his name until her throat was raw, and in her blind, panicked flight, she had run toward the only other person she saw in the deserted street, a tall, dark figure standing beside a car. She didn't see a mafia king. She saw a potential helper, a strong presence in a moment when she felt utterly weak. Aldrich looked at her. He saw the tremble in her hands, the tracks of tears and rain on her pale face. This was not a calculated move from an enemy. This was real. This was a primal fear that resonated on a frequency his soul, buried under layers of ice and violence, somehow still recognized. He didn't speak. He simply gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He lifted his phone, spoke a single, quiet word into it, find him. It was not a request. It was a command that would send ripples through the sleeping city, waking his network of men, setting in motion a machine of unparalleled efficiency. In that moment, his immense power, usually directed toward protection of a different, darker sort, was bent to a single, simple purpose, finding one small, lost boy. The search was a silent, swift hurricane. Men in dark coats appeared as if from the shadows themselves, their movements coordinated and precise. Mara could only watch, shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as this stranger, this impossibly still and powerful man, directed the operation with nothing more than a look, a gesture. He was an island of calm in her storm of chaos, and against all logic, she felt a flicker of hope. Then, a call came in. A small shape had been spotted, huddled and shivering behind a dumpster in a nearby alley, drawn by the light of a flickering street lamp. They reached the alleyway. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. And then she saw him. Finn, she cried out, her legs almost giving way. Her little boy was curled into a small, terrified ball, his clothes soaked, his small body shaking from the cold and fear. She rushed forward, but Aldrich was already moving. He reached the boy first, his large, imposing frame kneeling in the grimy wetness of the alley without a second thought. He reached out, his movements suddenly, astonishingly gentle, and gathered the trembling child into his arms. It's all right, Aldrich murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble, a tone few had ever heard him use. You're safe now. He stood, cradling the boy as if he were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. As he turned, the weak, flickering light from the street lamp fell directly onto Finn's face. The boy lifted his head, sniffling, and looked at the man who held him. And in that moment, the world, for Aldrich Varron, stopped spinning. The rain seemed to freeze in midair. The city's sounds faded into a dull, distant roar. Because the little boy in his arms, the one he was holding so protectively, had a pair of wide, intelligent eyes. And they were a shade of green so unique, so specific, that Aldrich had only ever seen it in one other person in his life. His own mother. A memory, long buried and painful, flashed before his eyes. A woman from his past. A pregnancy he was told had ended in tragedy. A story of a child who never drew breath. He had believed it. He had mourned in his own, private way, locking that part of his heart away forever. But as he stared into Finn's face, he saw the truth. He saw the subtle curve of the boy's brow, the same as his own. He saw a ghost of his own features in that small, frightened face. This was no mere coincidence. This was his son. His blood. His heir. A living, breathing part of him he never knew existed. The shock was a physical blow, a tremor that started deep in his soul and radiated outwards. He felt a surge of emotion so violent and conflicting it left him breathless. A roaring, possessive joy so fierce it was almost painful. A white-hot rage at the deception that had kept his son from him. An overwhelming, terrifying wave of protectiveness that dwarfed any feeling he had ever known. His arms tightened around Finn, a silent vow sealing itself in his heart. He would never let go. He would never allow this child to be lost, or hurt, or scared ever again. Slowly, he lifted his gaze from the boy to the woman. Mara was watching him, her own emotions a tangled mess of relief, confusion, and a dawning, nervous curiosity. She saw the way he held Finn, not like a stranger handing back a lost child, but like a father claiming his own. The air between them crackled, charged with a new, unspoken truth. The rain continued to fall, but it was no longer just rain, it felt like a baptism, washing away an old life and revealing a new, impossible one. Aldrich's eyes, dark and intense, locked with Mara's. The quiet, dangerous man was gone, replaced by something else, something just as powerful but entirely new. In a voice that was low, measured, and left no room for doubt, he spoke the words that would change all of their lives forever. "The boy is safe now," he said, his gaze unwavering. "But he is not just your son. He is mine, too." The confession hung in the rainy air, a truth as solid and unyielding as the man who spoke it. Mara could only stare, the reality of his words, the sheer force of his presence, crashing over her. She had been searching for her missing child, and in finding him, she had stumbled into the heart of a hurricane. The black car did not take them home. Mara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the small apartment above the cafe, with its cheerful yellow curtains and crayon drawings on the fridge, was a part of a life that was now over. The world had shifted on its axis during that rain-soaked confession. Aldrich did not ask, he simply directed his driver to a destination known only to him, his arm a protective, unyielding barricade around her and Finn, who had fallen into an exhausted sleep against his chest. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, a river of gold against the black, each mile taking them further from the ordinary and deeper into the heart of Aldrich Varen's kingdom. The mansion was not a house, it was a fortress disguised as a dream. It stood behind immense, wrought-iron gates that swung open silently, revealing sprawling grounds that were both beautiful and meticulously watched. The structure itself was made of pale stone, with vast windows that looked out over manicured gardens, but as they stepped inside, Mara felt the security, the silent hum of a world under guard. Cameras tracked their movement from discreet corners, and men in dark, tailored suits stood at respectful, yet strategic, distances, their eyes missing nothing. Aldrich carried the sleeping Finn up a grand, sweeping staircase and into a room that seemed fit for a young prince. It was furnished with a bed shaped like a race car, shelves waiting to be filled with toys, and walls painted a soft, calming blue. He laid the boy down with a tenderness that was at odds with his formidable presence, tucking the blanket around his small shoulders as if he had performed this ritual 1,000 times. Mara watched from the doorway, her heart a tangled knot of emotions. She saw the raw, undisguised love in Aldrich's eyes as he looked at his son, and it disarmed her completely. The first few days were a strange, quiet dance of adjustment and unspoken questions. Mara learned the rhythms of this new, gilded cage. The mansion was a world of whispered conversations and sudden, serious men appearing to speak with Aldrich in low tones behind closed doors. It was during one of these meetings, on the third day, that the first piece of the frightening puzzle fell into place. Aldrich emerged from his study, his expression a carefully controlled mask of cold fury. He found Mara in the sunlit conservatory, watching Finn play safely on the carpet. He explained, in a clipped, precise tone that did little to hide his anger, that Finn's disappearance had not been an accident. A low-level member of a rival group, seeking to gain favor, had learned of the boy's existence and his suspected connection to Aldrich. The plan had been a simple, cruel snatch and grab, a way to gain leverage, but it had gone awry when the nervous man had lost sight of Finn in the rain. The news turned Mara's blood to ice. Her son's terror, her own panic, had all been a deliberate act of cruelty from a world she never knew existed. Aldrich's voice was steel when he promised her, his eyes holding hers, "No one will ever come near him again. Or you. This ends now." It was this shared, ferocious need to protect Finn that became the bridge between their two separate worlds. Slowly, cautiously, the walls they had both built began to erode. Mara, who was used to the warm, open chaos of her cafe, began to see the man beneath the myth. She saw how he always ensured her favorite tea was waiting for her in the morning. She noticed the way he would listen, truly listen, when she spoke of her struggles to build her business, of her dreams for Finn. She saw the ghost of fatigue in his eyes after a long night dealing with the threats in his world, and a part of her ached to soothe it. She was kindness incarnate, a steady, warm flame in the cold, marble halls of his life, and he found himself drawn to her light, basking in its simple, honest warmth. For Aldrich, who had known only transactions and threats, Mara was a revelation. Her world was not built on power, but on heart. He watched her with Finn, with her endless patience and easy laughter, and saw a kind of love he had never experienced. He found himself telling her things he had never told another soul, fragments of a lonely childhood, the weight of the empire he had inherited and expanded, the constant, wearying vigilance his life required. He spoke of his mother, of her green eyes, and the painful void her death had left. With Mara, he didn't have to be the king. He could just be Aldrich. He could be a man fascinated by the way she bit her lip when she was thinking, a man soothed by the gentle sound of her voice, a man who felt the world quiet down when she was near. Their love did not announce itself with grand declarations, but grew in the quiet spaces between them. It was in the brush of his hand against hers as they passed in a hallway, a touch that sent a jolt of warmth through them both. It was in the long, quiet conversations by the fireplace after Finn was asleep, where the space between their chairs seemed to shrink with each passing night. It was in the way he would look at her from across a room, his intense gaze softening, filled with a wonder that made her feel like the most cherished woman in the world. The air between them grew thick with a sweet, aching tension, a magnetic pull that was becoming impossible to resist. The turning point came on a calm, starlit night. They were standing on the balcony overlooking the dark, silent gardens. The threat from the rival group had been decisively, and finally, eliminated. A palpable sense of peace had settled over the mansion. Aldrich turned to her, his profile etched against the night sky. "Before you," he began, his voice a low, intimate rumble, "my world was only shadows. It was about territory and fear. It was a fortress with empty rooms." He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, a touch so tender it made her breath catch. "You walked into that fortress, Mara. You and Finn. You didn't just bring light. You brought music to the silence. You brought a heart to a body that was just a machine." He leaned closer, his forehead gently resting against hers. "I love you," he whispered, the words simple, profound, and utterly true. "You and that boy are my world now. The only world that matters." Tears welled in Mara's eyes, but they were tears of pure, unshadowed joy. She saw the truth in his eyes, felt it in the reverence of his touch. This powerful, dangerous man had given her his heart, fully and completely. She rose on her toes, closing the small, final distance between them. "I love you, too, Aldrich," she whispered against his lips before she kissed him. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of a deep, soul-sealing promise. It was gentle and searching, a silent conversation of all the fears they had overcome and all the hopes they now shared. It was a kiss that tasted of forever, a perfect, pure moment where two broken halves from different worlds finally clicked together, whole and complete at last. In the quiet of the night, surrounded by the safety he had built for them, their new family was born, bound not just by blood, but by a love that had disarmed a king and tamed a hurricane. The peace that had settled over the mansion was a fragile, precious thing, like the first frost on a morning lawn, beautiful but susceptible to the warmth of the sun. For several weeks, it held. Life developed a new, blissful rhythm. Breakfasts were noisy, joyful affairs with Finn chattering about his dreams. Aldrich, who had once started his days with threat assessments and financial ledgers, now found his greatest priority was determining whether his son preferred blueberries or strawberries in his pancakes. Mara's presence had softened the hard edges of the house, filling it with the scent of fresh coffee and the sound of her soft humming. She and Aldrich existed in a state of quiet wonder, their love a tangible force that seemed to rewrite the very history of the stone walls around them. They were a family, a word that had once felt foreign and transactional to Aldrich, but now felt like the only word that truly mattered. This newfound peace, however, was an illusion, a temporary ceasefire in the endless war that was Aldrich's life. The rival he had dismantled, a man named Silas, had not operated in a vacuum. He had a brother, Cale, a man who was colder, smarter, and far more patient than his impulsive sibling. While Aldrich had been focused on building a life with Mara and Finn, Cale had been watching from the shadows, nursing his vengeance and searching for a crack in the king's armor. He found it not in Aldrich's security, which was impenetrable, but in the simple, predictable routine of their new happiness. He learned of their Saturday morning tradition, a small, unguarded trip to a private botanical garden on the city's edge, a slice of normalcy that Aldrich had insisted upon for Mara and Finn. The morning was bright and clear, the sun dappling through the leaves of ancient, towering trees. Finn ran ahead on the path, chasing a butterfly, his laughter echoing in the tranquil air. Mara walked beside Aldrich, her hand tucked securely in his, feeling the solid, reassuring strength of his grasp. For a moment, it was perfect. It was the life she had always dreamed of. But the dream shattered in an instant. A van, nondescript and silent, pulled across the path ahead, its doors flying open. Men, armed and masked, moved with a brutal, coordinated efficiency. Aldrich's reaction was instantaneous, a blur of controlled violence as he shoved Mara behind him, his own body becoming a shield. But their objective was not him. It was the smallest, most vulnerable member of their family. In the chaos, while Aldrich was engaged, another man swooped in from the side, snatching a screaming Finn from the ground. Mara's cry of pure terror was a knife in Aldrich's heart. He fought like a demon, but he was one man against a planned ambush. He watched, his world collapsing into a silent, horrifying slow motion, as the van doors slammed shut and the vehicle sped away, the sound of Finn's fading screams tearing the soul from his body. The silence that fell in the aftermath was more deafening than any explosion. Mara was on her knees, sobbing, her hands clutching at the empty space where her son had just been. Aldrich stood over her, his chest heaving, a cut on his brow dripping blood down his face. The look in his eyes was not one of defeat, but of a terrifying, primordial transformation. The man she loved was gone, replaced by something ancient and ruthless. The king had not just been challenged, his heart had been ripped from his chest. He pulled out his phone, his voice when he spoke was not the warm rumble she loved, but the flat, cold tone of absolute command. Every resource, every sleeper agent, every debt owed to him was called in. The city, which had begun to relax under his recent period of calm, was about to learn a final, brutal lesson about the cost of touching what belonged to Aldrich Varron. The following hours were a descent into a special kind of hell for Mara. Back in the mansion, now a buzzing hive of grim-faced men and glowing computer screens, she could only watch as Aldrich shed the last vestiges of his civilian skin. He was no longer the gentle father, he was the storm made flesh. He tracked Cale through a web of informants and digital ghosts, his mind a terrifyingly sharp instrument of strategy and retribution. Mara saw the full, terrifying scope of his power, not as a story, but as a living, breathing force of nature. And in that moment, she was not afraid of him, she was grateful for it. Her kindness met his fury and did not flinch. She brought him coffee, her hand steady on his arm, her voice firm. "Bring our son home," was all she said, and in her eyes, he saw not a plea, but a partnership. She was not a damsel in his dark world, she was his queen, holding the fort while her king went to war. The confrontation did not happen in a dramatic shootout, but in a cold, sterile warehouse on the docks. Aldrich went alone, not out of bravado, but because this was something he needed to do himself. He found Cale, gloating over a terrified Finn. The exchange was short, violent, and utterly final. Aldrich fought with a precision that was chilling, a dance of death where every move was calculated to end the threat permanently. He did not just defeat Cale, he erased him, a message to anyone who would ever again think to target his family. When it was over, he walked through the carnage, untouched by it, his focus solely on the small boy huddled in the corner. He knelt, and as he gathered Finn into his arms, the terrifying mask of the king fell away, and he was simply a father again, whispering promises of safety into his son's hair. The return to the mansion was a homecoming that felt like a rebirth. Finn, after being checked by a private doctor, was safe, his resilience already showing as he clung to his mother. When Aldrich walked through the door, covered in the grime and ghost of the violence he had enacted, Mara did not see a monster. She saw her protector. She rushed into his arms, not caring about the blood or the dirt, and their embrace was fierce, a sealing of a vow written in fire and loss. They had faced the worst the darkness could throw at them, and they had emerged, scarred but unbroken, together. That night, after Finn was asleep, safe once more in his race car bed, Aldrich led Mara to the balcony. The city lights glittered below, a kingdom he now knew was meaningless without the woman beside him. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the last traces of her tears. Mara, he said, his voice thick with emotion, my world began when I found you in the rain. It almost ended today. I cannot rule this city, I cannot breathe, I cannot be, without you and Finn by my side. You are my strength. You are my heart. Will you stay with me, always? Will you be my wife? Mara's answer was a kiss that held all the terror of the day and all the hope of their future, a kiss that was a promise of 1,000 tomorrows. Always, she breathed against his lips. The wedding was a small, private affair in the mansion's garden, surrounded only by the most trusted few. Finn, beaming with pride, held the rings. There was no more fear, no more lurking shadows. Aldrich had not just won a war, he had built a new world, a sanctuary where love was the only law. He had learned that true power was not in making others tremble, but in having a family to come home to, a family to protect, a family to love. The king had found his heart, and in doing so, he had found his true, lasting empire. If you've been swept away by the story of Aldrich and Mara, a simple cup of coffee can help you create more tales like this. Your support makes a difference. Subscribe for more.